Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so excited to have you here because today we're going to trace the profound legal history of our oceans. We're going to uncover the foundational rules that govern the world's vast watery frontiers. This explainer traces the historical evolution of maritime law from ancient customs to the modern UN CLOS agreement, revealing how centuries of dispute built the binding treaty law that governs the oceans today. We'll be covering ancient and medieval roots, the Grotius and Selden clash, cannons and coastal sovereignty, the 20th century expansion, the modern ocean constitution UN CLOS, and finally, a structured maritime law recap. Section 1. Ancient and medieval roots. Okay, let's dive into this. We begin not in modern, polished courtrooms, but way back in the ancient Mediterranean. And what's absolutely vital to understand here is that the earliest laws of the sea weren't drafted by kings or massive governments. No, they grew organically from the daily customs and the practical, everyday necessities of the merchants and sailors who were actually navigating those waters. Imagine, for a second, a wooden merchant ship caught in a massive, terrifying storm around 300 BCE. To prevent the ship from sinking, the crew literally has to throw heavy crates of grain overboard. Now, should the merchant whose grain was tossed lose absolutely everything? Will the merchant whose silk stayed nice and dry down below lose nothing? Well, ancient Greek maritime custom said, absolutely not. And this brings us to a precise legal term you need to know: general average. Originating from the Rhodian Sea Law, or Lex Rhodia, the strict rule is this: if cargo is jettisoned to save a ship in peril, all cargo owners share the loss proportionally. It's an incredibly fair concept, and it's still active law today, highly relevant in modern admiralty and maroon insurance. Moving a bit forward in time, I want you to think about the simple act of taking a deep breath of fresh air. Nobody owns that air, right? You can't fence it off or claim it as your own private property. Well, the Romans applied this exact same logic to the ocean. In Roman law, specifically Justinian's Institutes, we find our founding philosophical premise expressed by the Latin term res communis. Let me restate that exact rule so you can get it in your notes. By natural law, the sea, just like the air and running water, is common property and is absolutely incapable of private ownership. Now, as trade exploded in the Middle Ages, these unwritten day-to-day customs needed to be written down. It's here that we see two distinct geographic spheres systematizing early shipping, collision, and salvage practices into real rules. In the Atlantic and Northern Europe around the 12th century, we got the laws of Oleron, traditionally attributed to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Conversely, down in the Mediterranean around the 14th century, we got the Consolato del Mare. Both of these were fundamental early attempts to take those customary rules of the sea and codify them into written, predictable frameworks. Section 2. The Grotius and Selden clash. We now enter the 17th century, bringing us to arguably the single most exam-favored moment in the entire history of maritime law. This is the exact moment where high-minded legal philosophy violently collides with massive global economic stakes. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the direct head-to-head conflict here. Let's walk through this carefully. On the left side of the table, we have the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius. In 1609, he wrote Mare Liberum, which translates to the free sea. He basically argued that the sea is inexhaustible and cannot be occupied, which means it cannot be subject to sovereignty. Navigation must remain completely free. But why? Well, his direct underlying motivation was purely economic. He was defending the Dutch East India Company's lucrative trading rights against Portuguese monopolies. Then, on the right, we have the English jurist John Selden. In 1635, he published the direct rebuttal, Mare Clausum, or the closed sea. He argued the exact opposite, that states absolutely can claim sovereignty over adjacent seas. And his motivation? To defend England's exclusive fishing rights against those very same Dutch fleets. So you're probably wondering, who won? Well, neither won outright. The eventual resolution was actually a brilliant compromise: freedom on the high seas, combined with limited coastal state sovereignty near the shore. Make a special note of this because it's crucial. That specific hybrid structure forged in the 1600s is essentially still the exact architectural foundation of all modern maritime law today. Section 3. Cannons and coastal sovereignty. So that hybrid resolution was great in theory, but it immediately created a very practical problem. If a state has limited coastal sovereignty near its shore, how far from the beach does that property line actually extend? Is it 1 mile, 10 miles? Where do you draw the line in the water? To answer that, imagine you're standing on a beach with a loaded cannon. You fire a heavy iron ball out toward the horizon. Wherever that cannonball splashes into the water, that spot right there is where your nation's property line ends. That is exactly the logic proposed by the Dutch jurist Cornelius von Binkershoek in his 1702 text De Dominio Maris. He formally stated what became known as the cannon shot rule. The rule is this: a coastal state's sovereignty should extend only as far as it could actually be defended by cannon fire from shore. At the time, the effective range of a standard coastal cannon was, well, it was roughly 3 nautical miles. Therefore, Binkershoek's incredibly practical physical test crystallized into the customary 3 nautical mile territorial sea. And this 3-mile limit became the dominant, though maybe not completely universal, practice around the globe straight through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Section 4, the 20th century expansion. Let's move to the 20th century and see how this builds, and then violently breaks down. Because by the mid-1900s, technology had changed drastically. Offshore oil, deep-sea fishing, mineral extraction, all of this meant the old 3-mile cannon shot rule was simply no longer sufficient for nations who were incredibly hungry for resources. Let's patiently map out this timeline, because it escalates quickly. In 1930, the League of Nations held the Hague Codification Conference, but it completely failed to agree on the breadth of the territorial sea. Then came the absolute rupture point, the 1945 Truman Proclamation. The United States unilaterally stepped up and claimed jurisdiction over the natural resources of its entire continental shelf, which was well beyond the traditional 3-mile sea. This shattered the old consensus. It triggered a chaotic, rapid-fire wave of international copycat claims. By the late 1940s and 50s, Latin American states like Chile, Peru, and Ecuador went even further, claiming massive 200 nautical mile zones. The old system was literally in freefall. Section 5, Modern Ocean Constitution, UNCLO. The international community was now facing an urgent, massive mandate. They had to rein in these wild, unilateral claims and codify a universal, binding law before the oceans became a chaotic free-for-all of conflicting borders and resource wars. Getting everyone on the same page required an agonizing, decades-long negotiation process across 3 massive UN conferences. Let's step through them. UN Clause I in 1958 produced 4 separate conventions, but crucially, it left the actual breadth of the territorial sea completely unresolved. So they tried again. UN Clause II in 1960 convened just to fix that breadth issue, but it totally failed to reach an agreement. Finally, we get to UN Clause III, which ran from 1973 all the way to 1982. This comprehensive, grueling negotiation produced the binding 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And for some historical context here, India signed the final agreement in 1982 in Montego Bay and officially ratified it in 1995. So, the crucial point for us today is understanding exactly what UN Clause III resolved. Let's use an analogy to keep this clear. Think of your own property. You have a front yard where your word is absolute law. Nobody steps on the grass without your permission. Beyond that, maybe there's a neighborhood resource, like a local lake, where you have special fishing rights, but you don't own the dirt underneath. And then, far away, is a community garden belonging to the entire town equally. Here are the strict treaty terms that match that concept. First, the front yard. UN Clause settled the absolute sovereign territorial sea at 12 nautical miles. Next, the neighborhood resource. It created the 200 nautical mile Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. This is a genuinely new legal concept giving states economic rights without full territorial sovereignty. It also built out continental shelf rules extending from 200 up to 350 nautical miles. Finally, the community garden. The deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction, known formally as the area, was declared the common heritage of mankind. It cannot be owned by any state and is administered by the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. Oh, and to keep the peace, UN Clause also established ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, for dispute settlement. And this brilliantly illustrates why UN Clause is universally referred to as the Constitution of the Oceans. Think about it. It took the philosophical arguments of Grotius and Selden that had been raging for 4 centuries and finally settled them into a near-universal, binding treaty text. It's a staggering achievement in international law. Section 6, Structured Maritime Law Recap. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from sinking ancient galleys all the way to modern deep-sea treaties. So for those of you taking notes, let's adopt a structured review to ensure you've successfully consolidated everything we've just internalized.
In Phase 1, our ancient and medieval era, we learned general average from the Lex Rhodia, which is the rule of proportionally sharing the loss of jettisoned cargo. We learned res communis from Justinian, the doctrine that the sea is common property, completely incapable of private ownership. We saw these everyday customs codified in the Atlantic laws of Oleron and the Mediterranean Consulado del Mar. And crucially, we studied the great 17th century clash, Hugo Grotius arguing for the free sea to protect Dutch trade, versus John Selden arguing for the closed sea to protect English fishing.
In Phase 2, we tracked exactly how that clash resolved. Beienkirchen gave us the cannon shot rule, which crystallized into the 3 nautical mile customary sea. That standard held up nicely until the 1945 Truman Proclamation violently ruptured the system by unilaterally claiming continental shelf resources. This ensuing chaos ultimately forced the creation of the massive UN Close 3 framework, finalizing the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, the 200 nautical mile EEZ, the designation of the deep seabed as the common heritage of mankind, and the creation of IT laws. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought. The Constitution of the Oceans stabilized centuries of conflict. But as deep-sea mining technology advances further and further into the abyss, will the 1982 UNCLOS framework be robust enough to truly protect the common heritage of mankind from a new era of corporate exploitation? Keep that question in the back of your mind. Be sure to review your notes, and when you are ready, join me for our next Deep Dive Explainer, where we'll tackle the specific mechanics of drawing maritime baselines. I'll see you there.